Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the session with Christine and Jamila from the Education Endowment Foundation. We're just going to get started in one moment, but as you are joining us, if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat your name, your organization, and your preferred pronouns, as well as what you are hoping to get out of this session. So I'll share my screen right now, but your name, organization, preferred pronouns, and what you're hoping to get out of this session. Thanks.
Que me obligue a renacer. Dame vida y dame aliento. Que yo ya perdí el conocimiento. Solo quédate un momento hasta evaporarnos en el viento. No hay motivos para decirnos adiós tan pronto. Sigo vivo, créemelo, mi amor, no soy tan tonto. Si tú quisieras esta noche ir a bailar un cha-cha-cha, yo te puedo enamorar.
All right, thank you so much. Can see some of those coming through, but if you haven't already, if you wouldn't mind, please putting your name, organization, and what you're hoping to get out of the session into the chat. So good morning, my name is Gina Cicerone. I am the co-CEO of the Fair Education Alliance. It is an absolute pleasure to be here and have Christine and Jamila from the Education Endowment Foundation to share about evidence and impact as you scale. Just quickly before we hand over, a few bits about the Fair Education Alliance. So for those of you who have been joining so far, we are on day 4 of Impact Festival, and it's fantastic to see the momentum that we've built and the connections that are being created as a result of this. We are all here because we believe that no child's educational success should be determined by their socioeconomic background. And amazing that we have EEF here, share our vision, and excited to see how we can support you to evidence that change for young people as you're scaling today. We are 230 member organizations from across the education, youth, business, and third sectors, and really fantastic about the collective action that you are enabling as a result of your membership, specifically for getting to areas of greatest need, for taking part in the collective voice, and then for engaging and influencing policy on a national scale. We do have 2 programs, however, so if you haven't heard of our awards, we run 3 awards, one of which is the Scaling Award, which Siwon, who is on the call today, leads. But we also have our Innovation Award, which is open to the public, and our Intrapreneurship Award, which is for our FEA members to innovate internally. Both awards offer £15,000 of salary contribution for 6 months, and also 1 year of intensive support to be able to pilot, develop the initiative, and then sustain that in scale. So you can see the prizes on the screen, and also you can come to some of the information sessions that are happening next week, which are led by our current portfolio of our 10 award winners. So for innovation, those are happening on the 28th and 29th next week. And for entrepreneurship, that is happening on the 29th. And Tish is also leading a myth busting session on Tuesday, the 27th. So that's it in terms of the intros. From there, we are going to jump in to networking and hearing your thoughts so we can understand who's in the room and take it from there. So what we'd love to start out with is a question regarding your experience of impact and evidence. So if C1, you wouldn't mind popping this in the chat, love to know about, in the context of your own worker experience, where are you at in terms of thinking about impact and evidence? And what are the next steps in taking this forward? So we're breaking you out into small groups and just take 3 or 4 minutes within the groups to be answering that, introducing yourself, and we will send the attendee list. So, you only get to meet a few people in this session, but make sure you're doing the Zoom chat and checking out the attendee list to continue those conversations. But just focusing on this question, introduce yourself and then share your answers to that. So Siwon, whenever you're ready, we will get going. All right, thank you. So as you are joining the room now, I can see we have about 36 of us here in the room. So I hope that was fruitful and you could talk about the different elements of impact and evidence that you're experiencing, perhaps some of the opportunities that have presented themselves, but also the different challenges as you have considered and been scaling. I was just chatting with Jamila and with Christine whilst we had you in the breakouts. And I did not know the extent of their experience, not only at the EEF, which is incredible to have them here as a key partner today, but also from their experience at the Behavioral Insights team and also What Works. So you are in for an absolute treat with their expertise. And really, if you were with us in the last session, we were talking about partnerships with schools and youth centers, and it's critical, of course, to closing the gap is those partnerships, but really about targeting and thinking about the evidence and impact and working with young people in greatest need. So hopefully today we can get to a point where you feel really confident in evidencing that and also ensuring that your targeting is spot on so that we can ensure we're narrowing the gap and also speeding up recovery. So Christine and Jamila, I will hand over to you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having us. And just to say, we were intended to be joined by our head of programs, Eleanor Stringer, who unfortunately has been struck down by food poisoning overnight. So she sends her apologies, but Jamila and I are both very happy to be here. So I'm an evaluation manager at the EEF, overseeing our portfolio of independent evaluations. And I can let Jamila introduce herself as well.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm Jamila. I'm a program manager here at EF, so working with Christine alongside the rest of the evaluation team in managing a variety of programs.
Great. So we'll just be taking you through the session on evidence and impact as you scale. So we'll be talking about our work at EEF and bringing in some examples of programs that we've been involved with in the past. And there'll be opportunities for sort of breakouts and discussions along the way. So really looking forward to hearing your experiences as well. So just by way of introduction, the EEF is an independent grant-making charity dedicated to breaking the link between family income and educational attainment. And we were founded in 2011 with a founding grant from the Department for Education, 125 million, by lead charity Sutton Trust and in partnership with Impetus. And in 2013, we were designated alongside the Sutton Trust as the What Works Center for improving education outcomes for school-age children. And in EEF's history, we funded up to now 214 projects of 123 million pounds of funding. We've reached so far 1.7 million children and young people through these projects, covering 15,000 schools, nurseries, or colleges. So we're just celebrating our 10th anniversary this coming summer and using it as an opportunity to reflect on what we've done in the past 10 years and what we look forward to continuing to do. So on that note, EEF has sort of three pillars of activity. The first is evidence synthesis. So we try to synthesize and summarize existing evidence on teaching and learning practices and make those sort of summaries available to see what the research landscape is and identify gaps and recommendations. We generate new evidence. So we have a series of program evaluations and other methodological work that Jamila and I are involved in that tries to contribute to the global evidence base. And then finally, we mobilize this evidence. So we support teachers and school leaders and policymakers to harness that evidence to drive their decision making. And so we try to make evidence as accessible as possible and communicate it in a variety of ways, and also work closely with stakeholders and practitioners to really drive evidence-informed decision making. And of course, in doing so, we work closely with a number of organizations across the education ecosystem. So our synthesis work, we have a partnership with a dedicated team at Durham University and also collaborate with other evidence synthesis organizations. We have a panel of independent evaluators that we commission to undertake program evaluations, and these are across universities and independent research organizations. And then we have a network of research schools throughout the country, which are hubs and for disseminating resources, leading training, and sort of helping with this mobilization effort alongside national organizations such as the Chartered College of Teaching, the Institute for Effective Education, and so on. So we do feel very strongly about building partnerships across the sector and working very closely with other actors in this area. So to start with the question, why do we feel so strongly about evidence? Why does it matter? With limited time and resources, choosing what to prioritize and what to invest in is not easy. There's a lot of options out there, a lot of programs, a lot of pedagogical techniques, a lot of things to pursue in this area to try and reduce the attainment gap. And so evidence can be the first step in identifying what are the most effective approaches. And so we believe that an evidence-informed approach can help senior leaders and decision makers make informed decisions, both in terms of making the initial choice between alternative strategies, and then also in implementing that strategy as effectively as possible. So throughout this presentation, we'll be focusing on both the content of a particular intervention and also the importance of implementation and how well it's delivered. So in short, evidence can start to tell us what works, for whom, under what circumstances, and why. So that's at the sort of research use end at the practitioner level or the decision-making level. But evidence can also play a key role in developing and refining interventions to begin with. So evidence can tell us how to design a program, what approaches might be effective, where the evidence gaps are. And so our approach is always to start from the evidence. What are we trying to achieve and through what approach? And what evidence is out there to support this approach? Is the evidence of good quality? Is it right for the context? So if it was done in a very different setting or a different type of educational institution, how transferable is it to what we're trying to achieve? And recognizing that an evidence-backed approach is a necessary but not sufficient condition for achieving positive outcomes. So while it's very important to be aware of the evidence and use it to make these design developments and refinements, understanding that there are other necessary factors as well to achieve these outcomes, and we'll come on to describing what some of those are. So again, at EEF, we see part of our role to help navigate the available evidence. So as I mentioned, one of our pillars is to synthesize existing evidence. And so that's to use techniques such as meta-analyses or systematic reviews to summarize the findings from individual studies done by other researchers and sort of come up with a headline measure of effect or impact. And also to generate new evidence in the form of robust evaluations. And so to help kind of guide these evidence-based decision-making, because of course there is evidence and research out there to justify almost every position. And so the question then becomes how, as I mentioned, sort of how good quality is that evidence? How specific is it to what you're trying to achieve? And so at EEF, we're developing or we maintain a resource bank of good quality evidence to help sort of navigate this complex minefield of research and evidence. And so in terms of synthesis, we start by summarizing the evidence from existing meta-analyses and reviews about different strategies of teaching and learning. And we estimate the size of the effect from these other studies and present it in terms of a standardized mean difference or months of gain or months progress. So this is just to make these findings from other studies comparable across studies and across sectors. So that gives a sense of how much attainment gain can be expected from approaches in each category. And then we also estimate the costs of interventions that have been done previously and the quality of evidence available. So importantly, we also assess how robust the findings are that contribute to our syntheses and how much confidence we should place in the results. And so you may be familiar with our teaching and learning toolkit, which is available on the EEF website. And it summarizes 34 syntheses of research findings across 10,000 studies and 200 meta-analyses and systematic reviews across all these different categories of teaching and learning practices. And so the idea is the toolkit gives a sense of what the best bets are based on what has worked and what hasn't, as shown by previous research. And so, as I say, it gives a sort of headline finding in a comparable way of where the most promising approaches seem to be based on the level of increased attainment and also the robustness behind the findings. Importantly, it doesn't tell individual schools or individual programs what will work. This is a very high level indicator, but it's a good starting point for professional dialogue about what promising approaches might be. So from the toolkit, feedback approaches, for example, are very strongly supported, or metacognition and self-regulation. So we can use that as a starting point to think about, okay, well, how can we harness these approaches in what we do in our programs or schools? And just to flag as well, we've done the same for early years. So there's a separate early years toolkit, which describes the evidence in early years settings. And just to flag as well, we're currently doing a big project to update the toolkit. So it was launched quite a few years ago. So we're now going back and integrating the most recent evidence and sort of unpicking some of the findings and refreshing the categories of the approaches we show. So that will be available soon. So do watch this space. But as I was saying, evidence from meta-analyses doesn't necessarily mean that a program is guaranteed to be effective. So again, on the EEF website, you'll see that we publish the results from all our independent evaluations, and they're summarized in the same way with a cost, a month's progress, and a padlock rating for robustness. And then within that, you can dive into the sort of nuances of the result. But this is one that I think is a good example of something that was backed by really strong evidence-based rationale. So this was an intervention called Hampshire Hundreds, which consisted of an intervention that encouraged teachers to understand the learning needs of their pupils and to consider how to improve the quality of their teaching, in particular by using questioning and feedback. And so, as we've just seen, feedback is a very promising approach from the toolkit. So that suggests that this type of intervention would lead to positive effects in terms of achievement and attainment. However, the way the intervention was designed was to encourage participating schools to shape their own responses to the intervention and give them a lot of flexibility in terms of how the resources should be used within the classroom context. So in some schools, it was a targeted intervention with specific pupils. In others, it was a whole class intervention. And throughout the evaluation, a lot of the participants described some level of confusion about how they were actually meant to implement these recommendations, given the amount of flexibility that was given in terms of the design. And so ultimately, this lack of clarity translated into a null effect or 0 months progress in terms of the intervention on learning outcomes, because it wasn't implemented in a way that that could effectively translate that research evidence into practice at the school level. But similarly, a 0 months progress result at meta-analysis level doesn't necessarily mean that an individual intervention won't be effective. So we can look at this phenomenon from the opposite direction. So we can see that in the toolkit, mentoring on average has 0 months progress based on quite a strong set of evidence. But the impacts of individual programs within this category vary greatly. So some projects do find positive impacts, whereas others have certain detrimental effects or negative overall impacts, and so they sort of cancel each other out. But using this evidence as a starting point doesn't mean we should dismiss all mentoring programs. It just means we should think very carefully about what the program is trying to achieve and how it's designed and implemented. So coming on to that, how a project is implemented is vital and arguably as important as its content. So an intervention backed by the best possible research evidence but delivered poorly won't end up having the positive effects it was designed to achieve. And so we do have a guidance report called Putting Evidence to Work, which sort of tries to provide recommendations about how to implement change well. And so just to bring these two threads together, when developing or refining an intervention, we need to pay equal attention to the content, so that's the what behind the intervention, the evidence and theoretical approaches that underpin it, as well as the how, so how it's meant to be implemented and what processes are likely to drive that impact. And to do that, we need to understand the most effective ways to monitor implementation. And so that involves collecting and recording information about what is happening on the ground. It involves implementation process and activities to capture dimensions, including fidelity. So that's the extent to which the implementers adhere to the intended model as set out by the project design. So for example, if a program is meant to be delivered in weekly 30-minute one-to-one sessions between a TA and a pupil, we could look at, is it actually done weekly? Do the sessions last the full 30 minutes? Is it done in fact on a one-to-one level, or has some of the material been done in a group or a whole class setting? Do the implementers follow the curriculum that's been specified, and so on? So we really try to unpick how well the program design has been adhered to and followed. Then we could look at dosage, so how much of the intervention has been delivered or received. So again, if we're talking about this weekly session and it's meant to last for 10 weeks, how many of those sessions are actually delivered in schools? And similarly, if participants might miss lessons because of absenteeism or other reasons, how much of the program are they actually being exposed to, which could have an impact on the strength of the outcomes. Again, we can look at quality, so how well the different components of an intervention are delivered, as well as reach, so the rate and scope of participation. If an intervention is targeted at specific pupils, is it reaching the ones that are intended beneficiaries? And finally, looking at responsiveness, so the degree to which participants engage with the intervention. If we think of an education app, for example, how many users are there? How active are they? How frequently do they engage? For how long? All of these sort of metrics can give us a sense of how delivery is actually going, which can feed into the likelihood of that translating into an impact on attainment. But again, I'll pause here to say that good implementation in itself doesn't necessarily mean positive outcomes will result. So this is a recent evaluation that EEF published on Achievement for All, which showed that students participating in the program had 2 months less progress in reading than the business as usual control group. And the evaluation further suggested that poor implementation was not a factor in explaining this result. In fact, the authors concluded that better implementation of some elements of the program may even have been associated with the more negative effects. So the best implementers actually had potentially the worst results. And so, although we can't know for sure what was driving this, some of the hypotheses include that because this intervention was quite resource intensive, the schools that implemented it really well were therefore not allocating resources to other things that may have led to unintended consequences for learning. And again, the flexibility of the program was noted as another potential factor that schools may have implemented different components differently. And it may also have been the case that other school priorities began to compete with or overshadow the priorities set by Achievement for All at the outset of the program, such that it meant that it wasn't effective, and may in fact have led to worse outcomes compared to the business as usual. So we've emphasized the dual importance of content and process, but it also begs the question, how can we be measuring impact to know whether our design and our implementation are leading to the positive effects on learning that we expect them to have? So a traditional approach to evaluation might involve looking at data showing that only 50% of students in a class are on track to reach expected levels. 15 students then receive an intervention to improve their attainment, after which data suggests that now 65% of students are on track to reach expected. So the conclusion we might draw from this is that the intervention was successful in raising attainment, and now we have 65% of pupils on track. But the big question here is, what would have happened otherwise? Can we be sure that this wouldn't have happened anyway, even in the absence of the intervention? It could be the case, for example, that those students who then improved their attainment were particularly motivated and would have found other ways to improve even without being offered the intervention. Or it could be that they were accessing other interventions or resources that explain their improvement, and so we're actually misattributing the effect to this particular intervention. And so at EEF, the majority of our program evaluations take the form of randomized controlled trials, where we start with our population of interest and randomly allocate them to 2 or more groups, where one group receives the intervention and the other group continues as business as usual. And by randomizing, we ensure that as far as possible, the participants in the intervention and control group are similar across a range of observed and unobserved characteristics. So not only on things like age and location, but on things like motivation that is very hard to measure. But by randomizing, we can ensure that these characteristics are evenly distributed across the 2 groups, which means that when we compare them, the only difference between them should be exposure to the intervention. So at the end of the delivery period, we measure outcomes for the 2 groups and compare them. And in that setup, we can be confident that any difference observed between the 2 groups comes from the intervention and not from some other factor. Importantly here, we also include everyone who is randomized in the evaluation. So we don't just look at those who implemented the program well or those who attended the program. It's very important that we include everyone who was initially randomized in the overall analysis. And that might sound counterintuitive, but it's first of all to preserve randomization. So I mentioned the importance of ensuring that the characteristics of the 2 groups are the same, and the only way to ensure that is to maintain the randomized groups. But secondly, we also run the risk of misrepresenting the impact of a program if we don't include the ones that didn't participate. So if we think about summer schools, for example, which is quite a timely discussion at the moment, if we were to only measure the impact of summer schools on the pupils that attended this summer school, we would run the risk of essentially overestimating the impact of summer schools by not accounting for the fact that some pupils for whom summer schools would be targeted and beneficial don't ultimately go. And so that's something that we would want to reflect in our estimate of effectiveness for summer school programs. So a typical EEF evaluation will include these components. We'll look at impact, as I've just described. We also include a comprehensive implementation and process evaluation to try and look at the mechanisms underpinning the impact. If we see a positive effect on attainment, we want to make sure that we can explain why that change occurred. And similarly, if we don't find one, we use the implementation and process evaluation to understand why that might have been the case. Was it not implemented well? Were activities that meant to have happened done differently or adapted? Did certain links in the causal chain break down? And then we also look at the cost of how much each intervention costs to deliver. So it enables us to answer questions including, how is the program being implemented? How well did it work? Are participants being reached as intended? What unintended outcomes may have occurred? And what does it cost to implement? And again, we provide all these results for every evaluation on the website. But it's important to recognize that an impact evaluation actually comes quite a ways into the development process of a program or intervention. And so as a first stage, we would expect programs to undergo pilot studies, which aim to look at questions such as feasibility and acceptability. So they would be done in quite a small number of schools as part of an exploratory stage of development to assess whether it's possible to implement in the setting that it's been designed for. Do participants like it? Do participants use it? Do any adaptations need to be made to make it more feasible or possible to deliver at a larger scale? So there's quite a series of iterations that can happen before launching into this type of impact evaluation. But the next stage would be to go through an efficacy trial. So that's when we aim to test whether an intervention can work under ideal conditions. So the program developer would play a very hands-on role in implementing or overseeing the delivery of the intervention. And we have an initial assessment of impact at that stage. Then the next phase would be moving to an effectiveness trial. So that's where we aim to test whether an intervention can work at scale. So then we're starting to talk about maybe 100 or more schools where the developers are less hands-on. So often it will involve changing a delivery model from in-person training, for example, to a train-the-trainer approach, or to an online module that participants can follow in their own time. So there are adaptations that might need to be made to enable it to be delivered to a larger number of participants. And again, we measure impact at that stage. And then we look to scale even further to scale up evaluations, which aim to replicate promising results from effectiveness trials. But again, drawing on a network of real world support and starting to talk about quite large numbers and geographic spread of an intervention. And I'll come back to scale up evaluations later on in the session. But for now, Simon, I think if you could set up some breakouts, that would be great. So we're looking to discuss your thoughts on when an intervention is ready for an impact evaluation. So you can think about the context of your own program or initiative or others that you're familiar with, and think about this sort of pipeline and what things you would want to be in place for a program to be ready to start thinking about impact. So we'll break out for sort of 7 or 8 minutes or so, and then it would be great when we come back if each group could share 1 or 2 key reflections from your discussions with the wider group. All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had an interesting discussion in your groups. So I'm conscious of time, but I would like to hear your reflection. So if anyone has any comments or questions for the chat, please feel free to contribute. And in the meantime, maybe we could hear from a few of the groups. So room 1, that was Bertina and Layla and Kat, I believe. Does anyone have any thoughts from what we would want to see for an intervention to be ready for impact evaluation?
Yeah, we weren't too sure exactly what the question was, so we went a bit off piece, but we were wondering how different kinds of evaluation would determine whether like an intervention is ready for impact. So we were thinking, we've looked at a lot of quantitative data so far in this presentation, but we were wondering actually if we were looking at more qualitative things, would that change when an intervention might be ready for impact evaluation?
Definitely. And yeah, one thing that I didn't really have time to get into at the beginning was the different types of evidence that we can use. And so I think that's absolutely interesting to think about what data you have available and what kinds of approaches you can use to inform next steps. Room 4, Helen, Lucy, Rebecca, and Zoe. Do you have any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, we were talking about the fact that there's, you normally just do a lot of impact evaluation on your organization's core work. But there are also kind of a lot of other aspects where you can do impact evaluation as well. So like my function at Teach First is funder engagement, and we're really keen on evaluating the impact of those engagements as well. And it's not the main bulk of what Teach First delivers, but it's really important for both for us and for our funders to see how useful are those outreach activities that they do with us as part of their kind of funding partnerships. So yeah, we looked at kind of a few different aspects of that.
Great. That's really interesting. And one thing we're just about to come on to is sort of being really clear about what outcome you have in mind. So as you say, it doesn't have to be an attainment outcome. It can be an engagement outcome. It can be a sort of well-being outcome. So just thinking about all the variety of things that you can evaluate and just being really clear about what you're trying to measure. So I think that's great as well. I will hand over to Jamila now, but do feel free to continue adding comments and questions to the chat that we can come back to. But Jamila is going to start talking about the theory underpinning program design and refinement.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. And thanks everyone for your initial inputs. And as you said, as you already picked up, you really picked up on really interesting and essential points, and both on the types of evidence and the difference of outcomes that we may want to look at. So as Christine said, like, whilst evaluation is an important element of, when looking at impact and scaling, obviously evaluation is a crucial element. However, on the other hand, we really need to think a lot about program theory. And not only when designing an intervention, but also all the way through when we're working through the different steps, all the way through the scale up for that. We need to constantly going back and refining that program theory to make sure that it's still relevant and it's still good and fit for what we're trying to achieve. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to go through some key questions that we will need to look at when designing or refining an intervention. So first of all, is really starting from what we want to achieve. So really trying to think about clearly what is your aim, what is the aim of that specific intervention, what you're trying to achieve. Then secondly, again, going back to what Christina has already touched upon, which is like, what is the existing evidence telling us? So always start from that as a starting point. And then once we got that clear, then start going into the nitty-gritty, I would say, of the problem theory, which is very much like start thinking about how does change happen. And in that, it's just really, again, like looking at both the underpinning evidence, so both in terms of like quantitative and qualitative types of evidence that are there, and how can these inform the theoretical frameworks as the foundation for that. So how does that causal chain and the causal mechanism really interact to make that that change. And so from then, really, we're going to start looking at how to develop a theory of change, or we'll be looking specifically at logic models with implementation and impact in mind. And then finally, we'll very much stress what I already touched upon, which is very much, it's not a linear process. It's very much a process where there is continuously learning and room for improvement, and there is that idea that we really need to go back every step of the way to make sure that the program theory is still relevant. So as a starting point, so know what you want to achieve. So what is the aim of your intervention, of your program, or as you were saying, like as an element of the work of your organization? And you know, there's been quite a lot of discussion and a lot of confusion sometimes between the difference between aims and outcomes. So when we're looking at interventions, first of all, it is important to look at the aim. So the aim is very much the overall, you know, overall objectives of what we're trying to achieve. And normally they are more generic, and at times probably like an ideal situation. So like as an organization, you may not by yourself be able to achieve your overall aim. So an example for programs that we fund here at the EF, the overall aim would be to reduce the attainment gap between pupils from more disadvantaged background compared to more affluent peers. So that would be like the aim of a specific intervention. But then again, starting from that, really start thinking about what are the achievable set of outcomes that you would want to achieve with that specific program or intervention. And how does that intervention, so how do these outcomes contribute to the overall aim that you're trying to achieve? So to what kind of impact would that have, would that set of outcomes have on your impact? So once you have that clear, you will start looking at additional questions and the key areas that are fundamental to think about, not only when designing a new intervention, but again, as I said, like when looking back and thinking about scaling, is feasibility, is stakeholders, and its context. So in terms of feasibility, if you think about your outcomes, what, you know, is it really feasible to achieve that? And is the, you know, the approaches that you're choosing, are they really going to support you in achieving what you want to achieve? And again, what is feasible and what is achievable in the short term, as opposed to what are you expecting to see in the medium to long term? And then based on that, really think clearly about the stakeholders. See, who do you really need to involve in the process? Who are the key actors, and what is the role in facilitating that change to achieve your outcomes? And then again, like very important is the context. So there is you know, no intervention and no work works in an empty space. Obviously, like everything is really connected. So like, how is the context going to influence your intervention? What environment are we looking at, and what kind of components you need to take into account? And the reason why I mentioned that it is really important to have a clear understanding of what you're trying to achieve is that because sometimes you may try to, you know, we in general as a sector, I feel like sometimes we may try to achieve too many things. So we may try with one intervention claim they would have you know, impact on a variety of outcomes. But it's really important to look at the program theory to make sure that what we're trying to achieve is exactly, again, is realistic. So an example that I wanted to give here is of an intervention that we we tried and we evaluated through various stages. So we ran an efficacy trial as a starting point, and then it went through a regrant through an effectiveness trial. So this is like Philosophy for Children. It's an intervention. It's a whole school program that is very much looking at using like a pedagogy that is based on philosophical reasoning. And it's really intended to improve pupils' and teachers' capability to think in a caring, collaborative, creative, and critical way. So those are the forces that underpin the intervention. And it really intends to support pupils' personal, social, and educational development. So as you will see, like the way the intervention is set up is very much to work on that social and educational context, and the philosophical background is just very much working around that. And as part of this trial, the key outcomes that were looked at were, as a primary outcome, was reading for students who were eligible for free school meals. And then we looked at reading for the full cohort, again, maths for full cohorts and FSM eligible pupils, and social and communication skills. Then I would say, like, surprisingly or not, the intervention shows that there hasn't been any effect on the primary outcome specifically. So this is a very much a good example of really thinking clearly. So, for example, is really this intervention intended to have an impact on reading specifically, or is the impact on reading going to happen, but perhaps at a later stage? So it starts raising questions on what are the really, the key things that needs to be measured and when. So just to say, just really important to look at the program theory to address this and understand that. And again, as I mentioned, program theory is just very important. Doesn't happen in a vacuum, so it's really important to look at the theoretical perspective on the content and the processes of these interventions. So going back to what Christina has already touched upon in the introduction, it's just very important to start thinking about, are there specific approaches that already address what you're trying to achieve? Is there any available evidence that you may rely upon to start developing or refining your intervention? And most importantly, how strong is the evidence on these? Is there any contradicting evidence? And what type of evidence is there evidence coming from meta-analysis or randomized controlled trials? Or is there any more qualitative evidence that give a bit more insight on the processes and the perception of participants? So what does the evidence and what different types of evidence is telling you about your intervention, and how can you use that to develop and refine your program? And again, looking at previous studies, so is there anything that have tried to achieve the same objective, and what have they used? And just to say that it is just really important not to just look at the evidence for the content, so not just for the theoretical or experimental side of it, but also in terms of the implementation. So how similar approaches were delivered before? What does existing evidence tell us about implementations and implementation science, as well as the context in which these programs were delivered? So again, a really good example of a program that managed to capture all of these really well is embedding formative assessment. So this is very much a project that is trying to test a professional development approach that embeds formative assessment practice at school level. So this is, again, is a very good example of an intervention that has got strong theoretical grounding and on evidence, specifically on studies about conceptualization and the potential of formative assessment. And that has got, again, a really strong experimental evidence behind. So it really drew on the evidence around, the professional developments and around, studies that are showing that improving teachers' use of formative assessments actually has impact or improves outcomes. but also very strong understanding of context. So there's been an increased understanding of how like assessment for learning interacts and what kind of impact it would have on specific outcomes. So not only this program was designed with these elements in mind, but also was very much based, as I mentioned, around professional development and implementation science. So these are very much areas to look at, and this is a program that we've trialed in 140 schools and found an impact on GCSE outcomes. So then thirdly, once we've got those elements clear, so once we've looked at the evidence, we know what we're trying to achieve, then we can start thinking about how does change happen. And we can do this in many different ways. So you've probably come across in your practice already, in your work, these terms, and sometimes they're used interchangeably. Sometimes, actually they are slightly different and they mean different things, but there may be some confusion. So where do you really start from? So in how we look at our programs, we very much use the logic model definition. So we wanted to use this definition because we thought it's just really exhaustive. So it's from Public Health England, and it says that a logic model is a graphic which represents the theory of how an intervention produces its outcomes, and represents in a simplified way a hypothesis or a theory of change about how an intervention works. And then process evaluations will test and refine that hypothesis. So the reason why this quote is really interesting is that because it very much defines a logic model as a simplified version of a theory of change. So a theory of change normally would bring in a set of contextual factors that would influence an intervention. And this is very much a simplified version of it. So I thought I would just briefly go through the main differences between theory of change and logic models, just to clarify some of these questions. So as a theory of change normally gives a big picture and a summary of a strategic work, the logic model is really focusing on the causal pathways of that specific intervention. And likewise, as I mentioned earlier, the theory of change, because it's got like this bigger summary, bigger picture, actually includes a variety of contextual factors that may influence the outcomes of an intervention, and that includes even rival theories and rival interventions potentially that would influence this outcome. Whereas a logic model, again, as I said, like it looks at very much a pathway that is directly linked to the specific program and intervention in a sequential and temporal way. And normally people would start from developing a theory change, because that starts unpicking the why an intervention would work and why change would happen, and then subsequently develop a logic model that starts looking at how this change would happen. So in summary, a theory of change will very much explain if X intervention would take place, then this outcome will happen because this change will be in place because of this intervention. Whereas the logic model is very much looking at if there is a specific intervention that is implemented in a certain way, then we are likely to see a specific outcome. So our definition of a logic model, the definition that we use at the EF, is very much that a logic model is a visual representation of a program's inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and underlying causal mechanisms. So if we look at this, you would have, as you probably have seen in other logic models, a set of inputs and activities that are very much the resources and the tools that you put into your program that will then create a specific outputs, which are like the direct results of your intervention. And when we look at this area, this represents the implementation of a project, which is just very important that we said to look at specifically. Then when we look at the longer chain, then you have that these specific outputs would have an influence on short, medium, or long-term outcomes. So when we look at these outcomes, like the connection between the outputs and the outcomes is very much those causal mechanisms that we want to look at, and we really want to go back to when designing and preparing for scale up. So those causal connections and those mediators and moderators that influence the outcomes are what really matter. And this is why in this presentation, we really wanted to stress that when we think about scale up, program theory and logic models are very much one of the most important factors, and possibly one of the most difficult factors, because when you, if, for example, if you have a small scale intervention that has got specific causal mechanisms and specific links that are meant to work in a certain way to create specific outcome, you know, what would change if you were to scale up? Would that causal link or that causal mechanism weak, you know, become weaker? Would increasing the number of participants reduce, for example, that you know, that mechanism? So this is why it's always important to go back to thinking about this causal mechanisms, mediators, and moderators. So the moderators is contextual factors that influence this.
Jamila, sorry to interrupt. I'm conscious of time, so I wonder if we should start preparing for the next breakout.
Sure. So, oops, sorry, I'm just going back. Yes, so I'll just prepare for this. So, like, just very briefly in terms of things to look at, to be able to design an intervention with implementation impact in mind, is very important to be really specific on the type of outcomes you're expecting. So again, like, just think specifically about what are the positives and negatives, intended and unintended consequences, and really start thinking about how these can be monitored or measured, and then start outlining the active ingredients of your intervention and how this would play out if you were to prepare for scaling up. So what would change if you were to scale up the design? Again, I thought, like, because the next breakout session will focus very much on the intended and unintended consequences, whether those are positive and negatives. So I would just give a bit of like an introduction of this. So obviously we know that, like, those causal mechanisms and the changes can only, you know, can not only have a intended positive effects, but also can have like unintended consequences that could be positive or negative. So it's just very important to consider those when you develop your intervention, or when you, again, like when you look at scaling up. So in terms of the next breakout discussion, so thinking about program theory and thinking about what could be intended and unintended consequences of an intervention, we would like you to have a bit of discussion around this specifically. So thinking about a particular intervention that you may have developed or implemented, what were the intended outcomes and for whom? What could be the unintended consequences of your intervention, and again, for whom? And if you can, in terms of time, obviously you may want to focus on the first two questions, but if not, also what can you do to check in if that may be the case, so if you may have unintended consequences. So we'll have about 8 minutes, and then we'll do a brief round of feedback.
Yes. Welcome back. I hope you had a fruitful discussion as well there, talking about outcomes and measurement, and sort of making sure that you have a very clear sense of what any program or intervention is trying to achieve and what other factors could help or hinder that success. We just have a few minutes left in this session, so I am just going to speed to the next topic and wrap up in a few minutes, but just to say we're happy to share these slides afterwards if anyone does want to take a bit more time over them. So just to touch on the challenges of scaling evidence for impact. So I've talked about the pipeline moving through from pilot up to scale up evaluation, and particularly at EEF, we notice this transition between efficacy to effectiveness trials, as I say, introduces some interesting challenges and adaptations to programs, which can mean introduce challenges to maintaining the same level of impact. So this is an example of a program that had 9 months progress at efficacy level, made some changes to be able to deliver it at larger scale. So changed the delivery model, moved from a targeted to a whole class intervention, and moved from targeting transition to targeting primary pupils only. And you can see that moving from 26 schools to 86 schools and from 200 pupils to 5,000 pupils led to a much smaller increase in impact to 2 months from 9 months. And this is something that we do see quite commonly, that just by virtue of having to deliver something at scale, it can become less intensive, it can become less targeted, some of the mechanisms might change. So again, thinking as you're moving through with scaling, thinking through what are the key ingredients that you need to maintain throughout that process of scaling to ensure that your impact can be sustained throughout that process. And just to finally touch on some potential pitfalls of scaling. So you'll see on our website also that we are in the process of doing some scale-up evaluations, including the NELI early language intervention, which is being rolled out currently to early year settings, and the National School Breakfast Program. And these evaluations look at some of these pitfalls. So things like whether the extent to which the delivery model was sufficiently scalable, whether the strategy of scaling was sufficiently planned, whether there was organizational capacity to oversee the scaling in terms of resources and partnerships and structures that had to be put in place for that scaling to be rolled out. Things like context dependence. So an intervention might work well in a particular area because of a particularly supportive infrastructure, but to what extent can that be then replicated at a larger scale? Things like political and public response as well. As something becomes more influential in the system, it can invite either more support or more scrutiny. And then thinking about sustainability also. So a preoccupation with scale may mean that questions around embeddedness, sustainability, institutionalization, these kinds of long-term impacts might also be overlooked. So I just wanted to flag those very quickly. And we don't have time to do another breakout, but just for some personal reflections about in the context of your own intervention, to be thinking about what things you might want to do to prepare for scaling with these pitfalls in mind. But as I say, we can share these slides and just, this was a bit about our COVID resources that we produced over the last few months, but we'll leave you to peruse those, and just thank you for joining the session and for your participation today. Thank you for having us.
Amazing. Thank you so much to Christine and Jamila. If I can ask everybody to just come off mute, give a massive round of applause. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I think that there are a lot of comments about not having enough time. I think that's exactly right. This is a really, really meaty topic. We also had some quick breakout rooms, and I know there were some tech difficulties, which means that we want to keep the conversation going. So critically, use the attendee list, attend the other sessions, pick up the combos, because this is going to help us all going forward. So before I get on to next steps, we're just going to do a quick feedback session. So if you've been to other sessions, you know that we're capturing so we can iterate as we go. So Christine and Jamila, right on the short-term outcomes. So we're looking to understand the quality of the session today, and also the different outcomes, whether that's around the connections, around increased skills or knowledge, or none of them. So nothing too scientific, but it does fit with our logic model. So hopefully this is the first step for us, and then we'll be sending around a wider evaluation after Impact Festival closes on the 29th. So if I just give you a moment or two to do that, and then I'll talk about next steps.